This book, No Man's Land, was a game changer for me. I went to a program called Birthing of Giants, was able to meet in 2016 Doug Tatum. This is the guy that we need for our next program. And with our focus on these companies, I think you're going to be blown away with the work that he does. So with that, Doug Tatum.
Yeah, I'm not actually up here to do a speech. I'm on a recruiting drive. FSU was known for football. And if any of you have children or grandchildren that kick or throw a ball 60 yards, please contact me. We need some help. We flat need some help down there. So this is a great sized group. We're going to have a conversation about No Man's Land and a little background on where the material came from. So I am a fake academic. I had dinner with two real academics last night, two real scholars, but I am a faculty member down at FSU. But before that, I'm an entrepreneur. I started a firm and led it for 17 years, and we went from my credit card to a couple $100 million in revenues. We sold it to a public company in 2010. We were consulting CFOs and CIOs, so we kind of instituted the fractional CFO practice. I had, at its peak, we had 1,400 employees in 30 offices. So I've made every mistake you can make in the business, and wrote about a lot of them in No Man's Land. But the material came because, if you can imagine, I've got 30 offices. We're dealing with a lot of emerging growth companies. We did $100 million a year with private equity as clients. And I got to see model after model after model after model. And I remember sitting down and saying, these companies are getting stuck in no man's land. And I'm pretty sure there was some alcohol involved in that and some cigars, which I smoke. I don't smoke cigars in class, I chew them. I tell the students that they're pointers so I can get away with it. But in some strange sense, I kind of had a sense for the fact that companies were stuck in an area where they're too big to be small and too small to be big. And so that was the impetus for the material we're going to talk about. And what I'm going to walk you through to start with is kind of a very high level to show you who those companies are, what their impacts are. And then I'm going to talk to you about what it's like to grow through no man's land. The first and most important thing I believe I can say today, however, is that it is still legal in this country and ethical to stay small and make money. What drives me nuts is that we all tend to get up here on the stage, or the group. I'm an advisor to the Inc. magazine and so forth. Spoke to a lot, and tell everybody about big companies. I mean, I do that to get your attention, but that does not mean that you need to do that. Does not mean that your business is set to do that, and it does not mean you're not incredibly successful if you stay small and make money, become a giant, a small giant, as my friend Bo Burlingham wrote about. So the first thing you got to look at is I'm going to talk to you about what it's like to go to scale, with the express purpose of having you get strategic about why or if you should do that. Does that make sense? And we're going to walk through that. So the first diagram, this does not look like $1 million diagram, does it? Dr. David Birch was the first guy, MIT, applied mathematician, who built a time series database, which I'm going to share some data with you, and actually compare it to some of the study that Jim and his group just commissioned, which I thought was outstanding. I picked this time period from 2006 to 2010. So this database, which now exists at the University of Wisconsin, tracks every company in the United States for 20 years, including your company. So for those of you that own companies, I could find your company in the database. I could compare your growth rates and your employee count over time. I could look at your competitors. I could compare you against their growth rates. It's a fascinating, massive undertaking. We took money from a NASDAQ Foundation, the Edward Lowe Foundation, to set it up. It's now at the University of Wisconsin. But this one came from Dr. Birch before he retired. It cost him some $1 million to get him out of retirement. The beginning of no man's land is around 20 employees. 20 employees. That's going to average around $5 million in revenues, which is interesting because about 60% of the survey population that took or took the survey that was done are less than 5 million. So we're talking about 5 million, 20 employees. I'm averaging the gross revenue across, a large data set. If you're a construction business, you're going to have a lot more than that per employee. To 100. 20 to 100 is what David Birch saw statistically was an aberration that was two things. One is companies on average get stuck in there for about 15 years, but the ones that are growing through year, and I picked the time of the last recession. Everybody remember the last recession? It was a hell of a good one, right? During that time, those companies that are between 20 and 100 employees added 8 times as many new jobs, grew at a rate 4 times faster, expand 3 times more often. I've testified before Congress and the Senate with some of this data, and one of the things you got to understand is small businesses, okay, on general, across the economy, don't add jobs. Emerging growth companies in that transition add almost all the jobs. And large companies right now are shedding jobs, all right? So, and by the way, this is the size we can all ask questions as we go, so you don't have to wait till the end if you got any questions about the data. Now, can you guys read this? All right, I want you to look at something. I don't have a little pointer here. Do you guys see in 2020? I mean, we have it up to 2022, but I did it by decades for you guys to look at it. There's about 12 million companies in the United States. Now we're getting rid of all the not-for-profits. We're getting rid of all the one-person LLCs, etc. What I want you to look at is how few companies exist in the entire United States above 100 employees. This includes public companies. 16,000 between 250 to 500, 500 to 1,000, 6,500. It is ungodly rare to get a company above 100 employees. Now, you notice all that red over the right? 20% of the middle market has disappeared in the last decade. It's caused, and I'll explain to you why, by too much private equity chasing too few deals. And we'll talk to you about what's going on in the capital markets. That's something that I'm very close to. So the first thing I want you to look at is the demographics themselves show you plainly that it's very rare to scale. And we're going to talk about, as we go through this, why is that the case? Okay? Why is it the case? And why is it so difficult? But that is a shocking number when you actually think about the entire United States. All right? Now, let me, one other question. Let me get my reading glasses out here for a second. Got a bunch of young guys up here. Don't smile at me. There are other things you'll find out about later. We're talking about, so what's interesting in the survey done by Gloria, 60% of the surveys were less than 5 million. But what was interesting is, and 78% of all the businesses surveyed were between 5 and 99 employees. The bulk of them are going to be less than 20 employees based on our statistics. But 97% of them said that in the second generation they were in a maturity or declining stage. I would suggest to you that if they're of a certain size, they're too big to be small, too small to be big, and they're dealing with no man's land. What are the issues related to scaling? All right, now, what we're going to do now is I'm going to put a pair of reading glasses on y'all called the 4 M's. And we're going to walk through the transitions that a company has to deal with if they're going to scale. And my objective by the end of this is that you strategically sit down and think about those things, and that it drives some big decisions when you get back and think about your business. So the first thing is the market. Now, this is a picture of innovation in an entrepreneurial growth company. It's a picture of somebody messing something up and somebody cleaning something up. So I got to tell you, I was asked to do a speech years ago, and it was at a really nice place, at a really nice resort, and they were going to pay me a lot of money. So I said yes without checking out who it was. And my assistant of 25 years called me like 2 weeks before the thing and said, I think I've got them on the phone. You need to find out who you're speaking to. And it was to the Industrial Research Institute. Has anybody ever heard of him? And neither had I. So I get on the phone. I go, looking forward to coming out and speaking. Who's in the audience? And they go, the heads of R&D of the Fortune 1000. And I literally said, you mean like the head of DuPont's R&D? Oh yeah, he's on our board. He's in the audience. I said, oh, we have a problem. And they go, what do you mean? I said, I'm like a one-trick pony. It's like, I know, like, I'm going to talk about entrepreneurs and growth companies. These corporate executives, they're going to be out at the bar the minute I open. We have a problem. I literally asked them if they would consider getting another speaker, and I said, look, if you got to pay them more, I'll make up the difference. So this is not going to go well, right? Can you imagine? I show up with my FSU hat, blue jeans, and there's the head of corporate development for all these companies. Well, if you're going to go down big, right? So I started with this diagram, and my opening statement was, you guys and gals that are in charge of research and development, innovation in your companies are out of business. You cannot do it anymore. Get to know the head of your M&A, because you're going to buy it in the future, because you can't replicate the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Now that's going down big, right? Well, they ended up publishing, okay, because I was right. They can't replicate the entrepreneurial ecosystem represented by that diagram. Because you know how innovation happens for those of you running your businesses? A client or a customer comes up to you and asks you, can you do this? And you look deeply in their eyes and you say, yeah, we're an expert at that. And you're lying through your teeth. You've never done that. Who's done that before? Jim, I know you've done that. We've all done that. Right? I mean, seriously, I've done that. So, yeah, we're out, and then you go back and you tell your group what you just promised, and they go, you got to be kidding me. But what's amazing is entrepreneurs, what they can do is that early on, they're managing the promises in the marketplace while they're managing operations, right? Simultaneously. And entrepreneurs are really, really good at meeting those promises, and the business grows. Okay? That's the way innovation happens. There's nobody in a large corporate environment that has the authority to do that. They just wait for somebody else to clean the ideas up, and then they buy it. And that's what's going on in the U.S. But here's the issue. When you are an emerging or an early part of your transition as a company, you're very simple to do business with. How many of you came from larger organizations? Raise your hand. At one time. How many times did we sit in a meeting going, you got to be kidding. We know what we have to do, but I can't swim in this peanut butter anymore. I mean, getting the organization to be simple to do business with is really hard when you get bigger. But when you're running both sides of the operation, right, I call Jim and everything gets taken care of. Does that make sense? The problem is, as you grow into no man's land, you introduce complexity because of the bandwidth issues. I mean, some of you got more stamina than a Navy SEAL. I mean, it's ridiculous. The bottom line is, everything starts falling apart because everybody says, we come in from the university, well, you need to delegate. So you delegate somebody making a promise out there in the marketplace. They come back and tell you what they did, and you go, you have got to be kidding me. You did not promise we could do that. or you delegate something on operations, and they don't know how to sequence the priorities based on the promises that are made, right? And it becomes a disaster. And all of a sudden, the minute you get complexity between you and your customers, all of a sudden you say, well, I must be in the maturity or declining stage because I'm not growing anymore. What's happened is you are out of alignment with a changing customer set. And there are some techniques to get back into that. And it has to do with that the business as a whole has got to become good at what you, the entrepreneur, are good at in order to do that. Now, let me tell you a story. So there was a guy that came out of the audience down in Florida, and he was in used aircraft parts distribution. Is anybody familiar with that industry? No, I wasn't either. And the first thing was, I said, you better not be selling that damn stuff to Delta. Because, I mean, if I die and go to heaven or hell, I'm going on Delta through Atlanta. I mean, that's what I got to do to get back tonight. And it's, you know, he assured me he wasn't selling, you know, used turbine parts to Delta. But apparently there's an industry out there in private aviation where they're refurbishing jets all the time. He was between the folks that refurbished the parts and the folks that were doing the refurbishing of the jets. So he was at about 20 or 30 million bucks, very small staff, very tight margins, as you can imagine with a distribution business. So I asked him, I said, so he said, I'm in no man's land. I'm exactly what's happening. I'm working as hard as I can work. I can't grow anymore. And he said, what do I do? I said, what are you good at? And he said, no, I need you to tell me how to keep growing. I said, what are you good at? Or I can't. And he said, well, I'm good at buying right. I said, what do you mean buying right? And he said, well, to be honest with you, Doug, he said, I'm really not selling anything. I know the refurbishing market on both ends. And so I go to the guys and gals that are refurbishing an airplane. I find out what parts they want. I go buy them right and flip them to the folks that ultimately do the refurbishing. So he's a trader, Trader. Does that make sense? So what we discovered was that one individual that the whole world surrounds as an entrepreneur can do about 20 or 30 million dollars of that before it starts breaking down. I mean, you walk into these companies and they look like third grade soccer. You guys know what third grade soccer looks like? Right? She must have somebody in third grade soccer. But it's like, you know, everybody running everywhere, right? That's the way these businesses look like. And so I said, so if you're buying right, what happens if you don't buy right? And he said, God help us. If I don't buy right, this stuff doesn't sell, inventory swells, margins decrease, cash flow goes to hell in a handbasket, I'm out of business. I said, so when it comes to delegating, look, I mean, let's be absolutely honest. I took a company up to large scale. I'm a control freak. Everybody's an entrepreneur is a control freak. The issue is, what do you delegate? All right? So I asked him, I said, you cannot delegate buying right. You've got to set up a system that buys right. And if you let somebody try to do that, you're going to go down the tubes. Can you set up a process? A set of procedures, a set of people, processes, technology, whatever the case may be, that buys right, then you can scale. If you can't, you're better off to stay small and make money. Does that make sense? So he has to transfer what he was good at into a process. I asked him, and we'll talk about it later on, what other part of the business is there? And most of it was logistics and transportation, picking stuff up. I said, well, there's some executives down the road at UPS, junior executives that forgot more about that than you do. You can delegate to them that part of the business, but you can't delegate that value proposition. And until you can make sure that your value proposition can be transferred to the company from you as the entrepreneur, you got to question whether you can scale. Is that fair? All right. So think about that. It's really, really hard to figure that out because remember all those promises you made? Those are all potential value propositions. The problem is some of them don't scale. I'm a financial guy by background, CPA, hired gun, CFO. That's where we start our business. You know how many times when we would run a model, we would turn around and say, fire your biggest customer? And they go, what are you talking about? That one customer was a one-off promise. It's not what the market wanted. It's what that customer wanted. And your bandwidth is being consumed by that large customer, let alone whether it's profitable or not. And by getting rid of that customer and going backwards, you actually are creating capacity and you can concentrate on something to scale. That's the key strategic issue that you got to look at when you're deciding whether you're going to take it to the next level. All right, any questions? By the way, this comes from the Inc. 5000, where they allowed us to poll them. 85% of us say, oh yeah, my employees, my inner circle, they know what our value proposition is. But when you actually poll their leadership teams, which we were allowed to do, 7% of them could articulate a common reason for why you win in the marketplace. That is strategy at its essence. What is it that allows you to get the vote of your consumers, your customers? All right, now we're going to go to management. Now this is a doozy. This is the emotionally, the absolute most difficult transition when it comes to scaling. The key is culture. And we heard a lot of discussion about culture. Everybody blames it or gives it credit for everything, and I've never heard anybody define it. I was asked in front of a stage, when I was on the stage with a big audience by Bo Burlingham. It's like, all right, big boy, you're criticizing this. What is it? So I'm going to tell you what I think it is and then let the debate begin, right? Because we've got a lot of experts here. The first thing is, if you were to bring in somebody and they didn't work out, has anybody done that? Ever bring in somebody and it didn't work out? Okay. So if I was to interview you, part of what you would say was, well, they just didn't understand our culture. If I was to interview them, they would turn around and say, well, the culture doesn't allow us to do the things we need to do to fix the business. Both people will blame the culture and nobody defines it. So I'm going to define it as follows. First of all, there's the inner circle, there's the ticket to the inner circle, and there's the decision-making rules, and that defines the culture. Because I think there'd be a different definition in everybody in this room. So what is the inner circle? Well, I learned that. Let's go back to my old firm. Okay, 30 offices, 30 managing partners, an executive layer on top of that, a board of directors of partners that I brought in. And I'm sitting there, I'm doing an annual or biannual partners meeting with 2,000 people with their spouses. I'm doing publishing a strategic plan every year, updating it every 6 months, doing evaluation every 12 months. Guess what I found out was the most impactful way to signal a change in my organization. It's who I let in or who I kicked out of my inner circle. All right? Now, every one of you running businesses have an inner circle, defined as who's in the room when you close the door to make the big decisions. Think about it for a second. Who's in your inner circle? Could be your Vistage chair. It could be your spouse. It could be certainly some of the folks in the business, could be an advisor. But they're in the room when you make a big decision. And guess what? What you don't realize is that everybody in my firm, with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, knew who was in my inner circle. Everybody in your firm knows who's in the inner circle. Now, the ticket early on in the business to the inner circle has always been, correctly so, loyalty. It's loyalty. These folks were with you when you didn't know if you were going to make payroll. You know, when you were like playing chess at night, I call it playing chess at night, looking at the ceilings. You go chess, chess, chess. Ooh, I lose that game. Chess, and you can't find a way. So it's the Monday morning strategy, which is just show up and hopefully catch a break. right? But these folks were there because they were loyal to you, they were loyal to the business, and you really couldn't afford them. So the way you paid them is with titles, like CFO. So I've met some CFOs that might be an assistant controller, but their title was CFO. You're vice president of sales. Why? Because you're my best damn salesperson. I can't afford to lose you. But this person has never set up a channel, comp plan, scaled, a sales channel, but they're now your vice president of sales. All right? Now they're in your inner circle. The business decision-making rules, and I'm going to tell you about the change when it comes to scale, has to do with the implied and generally understood who makes what decisions and who's allowed to make what other decisions. They're not documented, but they are highly refined and well known within your group. In other words, you can go into a business where the owner makes every decision, where they only make certain decisions about certain things, but it's highly known how that works. But let's go back to the ticket to the inner circle is the biggest change if you're going to scale. And here's what it is. It has to go from loyalty to performance. And when you go from loyalty to performance, you end up literally kicking people out of your inner circle. I'm a big believer that entrepreneurs can run big businesses. They can't with the same people they started with. It just doesn't work that way. And you got to hire at the top, not the middle, to get there. When you hire at the top, you're changing your inner circle. Now let me explain how difficult this is. I was at another university, I forgot who it was. Maybe it was Virginia. It was West Virginia, because they beat us in football that year. No, it's Virginia Tech. Doesn't matter. Everybody beats us in football now. I'm in a room, there's a couple hundred people, there's real business people like y'all, real advisors like you guys. And what's interesting is they had MBA students. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to describe the agony of this decision. And I picked on a young woman in the front who was an MBA student. And I asked her name, and she's freaking out, right? It's like, why? It's why you don't sit in the front pew at a church, right? There's no upside to that. So I'm sitting there, and I go, what's your name? And she goes, Debbie. I said, who's your soulmate? And now she's really freaking out. And your girlfriend, if you're mad at your boyfriend or your breakup or your dad or whatever, I said, and she was like, really? I said, yeah, what's her name? Susie. I said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go meet with Susie after this session down at the Starbucks on campus. I want you to tell her that you could not have gotten through graduate school, because you're graduating, going in the real world. Graduate school without her friendship. She was indispensable, irreplaceable to you. But then you tell her, right after you say that, however, I'm going in the work world, you're no longer sufficient to be my friend. You tell her that, and everybody gasps. Say, how can you say that? Well, when you sit down with somebody in your inner circle, and you've got a business that has grown into this no man's land, and and everybody knows that you can't go any farther with them, to have that conversation is that brutal. It's incredibly brutal. But here's what you have to do. If you're going to scale, you have to increase the speed and lower the risk of the decisions. I think you were talking about good decisions. You have to increase the speed of them, but you have to lower the risk of them. You can't get them wrong at this scale. I've run small businesses and I've run big business. In my late 20s, I ran a national firm, and it was so damn easy because I could piss away $2 million, and there wasn't a problem. You make a big bad decision when you're at 5 or 10 or 15 million bucks, it can put you out of business. All right? Perfect examples. I get a phone call from Inc. And I won't name the company because she's a celebrity to a certain extent right now, not necessarily for the right reasons. Some of you ladies would know who she is. She was in the fashion business. Inc. had done a big article. She was exploding. Her business was going like this. She started off as vintage clothing and then had her own line. So she was in her online retail. They said, you got to talk to her. She's in no man's land. So I get on the phone with this incredibly talented young woman, West Coast. I said, what is everybody telling you? And then she said, well, they're telling me I got to bring in a CEO. And I went back to that, well, what are you good at? And she says, I know what women between 25 and 40 want to wear on the West Coast. It was nothing my wife would wear, so I had to take her word for that. But the bottom line, she says, I'm super, super picky about the way the clothes look, the models look, the way they fit, all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, what happens if you delegate that to somebody? Well, the fashion business has got a product life cycle of what, a year at best? An old client of mine owned Yves Saint Laurent. I said, why'd you get rid of it? He said, well, we pumped money over to France in the fall and it came back in the spring. We never understood why, so we got rid of it. Sold it to him. It's a very scary business. She literally, I said, if you're good at that, what's your problem? And she goes, I said, we used to call it the rag business. I said, all this stuff is offshore to Asia. She goes, oh yeah, that's our issue. I mean, we have all the supply chain and this, that, and that. I said, well, do you know a competitor that's twice your size in the fashion online business? She named a couple. I said, why wouldn't you go out and hire somebody from them and steal them and break them into your COO or Vice President of Operations? And she literally goes, this is a true story, she goes, you can do that? I go, yeah. And I said, think about it. You bring that person in, because she was trying to allow somebody who had been homegrown to figure that out. You bring somebody in that's been in a company 2 to 3 times your size to take over that. They know every vendor, they know the ERP system, they know the pricing, they know who to call, they know who to negotiate, they know what, think of the speed and the reduction of risk and the decisions that needed to be made. Who was it said you got to make decisions? That was a great comment. Who was it? Somebody here. Yeah, I thought it was great. That you have to do that if you're going to scale. You cannot allow yourself to have everybody learn on the job if you're going to go to the next level. And that creates very, very difficult decisions. Has anybody ever had to deal with that? And then what does the sun shine and the clouds part and everybody asks you, why did you wait so long? But it's very, very difficult. If you stay at human scale, small, that's fine. You could. They know your weaknesses. You know their weaknesses. You can play off each other. You can make money. You can be satisfied with that. But if you're going to really go through this no man's land, you're going to have to consider those decisions, and they're very difficult. Now we're going to go to the model. This comes from being in a CFO firm where we ran models, where we were developing not budgets, but developing economic models so you could test your decisions about growing before you grow. Early on, you might have a profit on your financial statements, but it's artificial because it's your high performance cheap labor. You could make more money working in another business than you do in your own business. If you show a profit, that's because you're underpaid. When you get to scale, things normalize. You have to pay people competitive rates, human capital costs are going up, and you'll end up, that's not an economic model that scales, is your high performance cheap labor. All right? Now, what I want to show you is a diagram. We find that there is a thing called stepped fixed costs in that transition. And that's when your overhead requirements exceed your revenues. Your gut says, I can't go to the next level unless I invest a lot more. But then you got to say, oh, but if I invest a lot more and I don't get to the next level, I got a problem. Anybody ever Sense that in your business? Well, to prove to you that point, and I could tell you a bunch of stories, but let me come back to that. I went out to some private equity folks and said, pick the smallest that I knew, the smallest company you've ever invested in, and show me the infrastructure capital commitments and when they happen. So here's one. These are live companies. So there's a little company below 4 million, then all the way up to 14 million. Wonderful, beautiful growth every year. Does everybody see that? Underneath that water, look at that green. In 2009, they had to put a huge amount of money in that infrastructure to keep that business going at one time. Here's another one. This one started less than 10 million and ended up at 50 million. Look in 2009. Here's another one. That's actually LDC Partners down in Louisville. Look at the post-closing capital expenditures they had to make to keep that business growing. If you take a look at that, what you don't want to do is drive yourself into that without knowing where the other side is. And here's one of the issues, traps we fall into. So while you're here listening to me, besides the fact that there's not a lot of good things going on in your email, right? It's always the case. There's a conspiracy going on. Some of your employees are sitting back and they're going, hey, when she comes back to the office, she made all these promises, we're working, we need 2 more people. So what we're going to do, they're convening, they're saying, they're literally having a meeting, so let's hit her up for 4. So you come back and you go, they say, what's your name? I can't see you. Jessica, we need 4 people. Jessica sits down and goes, y'all aren't thinking about this right. Look, we can do this, we can do that. I understand, blah, 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 blah. We only need 2. They walk out with a grin, and you walk out thinking how brilliant you are because you just saved 2 people. Now, let's change the conversation. Let's say they came in to Jessica and said, we need you to borrow $700,000 to any of you. What would you say? Are you kidding me? I mean, I got to repay that back. What's my return on that investment? Where's it going? That's a lot of money. Well, in a nicotine-induced state one time, I was trying to explain this, and the way I did it is I said, let's take $56,000 a year employee. That's about a $40,000 a year salary. Would y'all agree? By the time you add FICA, FUTA, 401k matching, major medical, you're pretty close, right? That's supposedly the new minimum wage. So this is not a highly paid employee. That's the capital market equivalent of borrowing $300,000 over 7 years at a really high interest rate. Those 2 employees are identically, economically, the same as $600,000 worth of borrowing. Which is why when I was a CFO or we were dealing with large companies, don't ever bring me people to hire. Bring me capital expenditures because they're so much cheaper. Bring me automation, bring me technology. Because at the end of 7 years, I've paid that off and I can start over again. At the end of 7 years, if I hire those people, they're more expensive. That's thinking in terms of economic models. And that's what happens. Okay? And we say, well, Tatum, if I borrow that money, I got to pay it back. I can fire the employees. Yeah, right. A lot of times entrepreneurs you have no idea the extent you will go to not fire somebody whose family you know. A lot easier when a big company, when you go, we got to riff this part of the organization, I don't know anybody. But when you're doing it in a small company, you know everybody, you know their kids, it's brutal. Okay? So just to prove this as a point, somebody was talking about a family business. This is aggregated IRS data. Nobody in the freight forwarding business between $20 and $50 million made any money in the industry. The reason I pull this is I was interviewing a family, 4th, 5th generation business down in the South, freight forwarder, and they were stuck in no man's land. And I went and pulled this data. I mean, this you go into the boardroom and it's like a movie set, pictures of the former founders in this ornate boardroom. Every ant in that area living off this business, family members, and they're like, your granddaddy got it through the Second World War. What's your problem? The dividend went down $1. It was brutal. Well, when I pulled this up, guess what we found? Everything below 20 million was in one port. There's no requirement for a sophisticated tracking infrastructure because you could deal with everything in one port. You didn't need it. Everything above that was in multiple ports. U.S., FedEx, and United Parcel, UPS, were now in the business. So you had to compete with their transparency and logistics. So you had a major investment. This guy got literally, emotionally, tears in his eyes because he said, if I'd have known that, I'd have either sold the business to get there or gone out and gotten private equity to become a platform to get there. He was stuck there. He was on the edge of his covenants, and he didn't have the capital to get there. Brutal. So part of growing is having a reason to grow. Are you going to make money by getting bigger? And I'm here to tell you that there are dead zones in every industry, and you need to understand where they are because you don't want to work yourself to death and drive your business into that dead zone. Now money. And how much time do I got left?
About 16 minutes, I think.
About 16 minutes. Okay. There's a new normal going on. And I'm gonna tell you a little bit about it. It has to do with scale, and it has to do with too much money chasing too few deals. There's good news and bad news related to it. But in terms of the money, the first thing I want you to look at is the scale. When wasn't Birch, it was Don Walls, Harvard economist, picked up where Dr. Birch, when he retired, the database. He's a Harvard economist, and he did a little piece of work for me that showed that 2 decades ago, guess who had the highest level of employee productivity in the U.S.? Small businesses. Businesses, because you got a lot of revenue out of a very few people. Guess what's happened now? It's completely switched. Large companies have significantly more revenue per employee than smaller companies. And that is a sea change in the economy. And I'm going to show you an example out of a speech I did for the Banking Association. I played around with some numbers, and this is revenues per employee. So the above $1 billion, $1 billion to $5 billion bank, their revenues per employee are 14% higher than $1 billion bank. A $5 to $10 billion bank is 21% higher than a $1 billion bank. A $10 to $25 billion bank is 50% more revenue per employee than a $1 billion bank. So scale is enormous in that business. So if you have the competitive advantage of being large and having a lot more revenue per employee, what do you think is going to happen to the number of banks in the country? There it is. It dropped off the map. This is what's going on. There are 1,400, maybe 1,500 investors, excluding family offices, that play in this space. You usually co-invest with them. There's 1,500 investors that now are sitting on, and that's 21. Dang, I had the 22 number. The 22 number is $980 billion of dry powder. That's private equity. 1,500 of them. $980 billion. Now the way they're paid is they have 5 years under a management contract. Money is locked up for 10 years. But 5 years to get that money deployed, or they lose their management fee on the committed capital, and it's only on invested capital. There's enormous pressure to get that money out. The folks that were in private equity would come to me, and they go back to that original schedule. You remember how few companies there were? I got all the private equity companies in the United States matched in that database, and I would look at them and say, what percentage of the middle market do you think you already own? And they would go, can't be more than 3 or 4% of the entire thing. I said, try 50%. Try 30 to 40% in some segments. And they go, you've got to be kidding me. Which explains why they came to me because they says, we can't find platforms to buy. And I said, well, you're not going to give the money back. So here's what's going to happen. This is through 22, first quarter. 80+% of every deal in the United States is what they call an add-on acquisition. The new normal in the capital markets is that it's cheaper to buy customers than it is to win them the old-fashioned way. Which explains to you, how many of you have heard of competitors in your industry being bought by private equity? Yeah, there's a lot of hands in this room. The reason is when we first started serving private equity in my old firm, they would say, Tatum, we're looking for deals with 25 million in EBITDA, minimum. Wink, wink, will go down to 15 if it's really good. It's now down to 2. 2 to 5. There's a valuation inflection point at 2. There's a valuation inflection point at 5. What's interesting is they're not buying your company to grow your company. They're buying your company to hook onto a platform they already have in the industry, which explains that reduction in the number of companies in that first schedule. It was red. That's what's going on. Mass consolidation built around scale. If it's a business that they believe the bigger they get, the more profitable it can become, they are driving huge amounts of capital. Now, what's good about that is that the value of your business is if you get them capital market ready, you take advantage of all the things I've been talking about right here. You get them where, you know, there is a value that you can transfer to them. Could very well be some of your management team, could be some of your innovations and systems that they want to do. I just was involved in helping somebody sell a company to a family office up in Canada, and they had some freaking commercial cleaning business. You know, he'll end up with 10, 12 million bucks out of a $10 million company because he had some unique things and he was positioned right and he was thoughtful about what he was going to do with his business, and he decided he didn't want to try to scale it. So the good news is your businesses can be worth a lot of money. The other part of the news is you can stay small and make a lot of money, be incredibly wealthy and important, but your value of your business is significantly different if you scale it than if you don't, right? The risks of scaling are enormous as well. But that's what's driving the capital markets, is add-ons. They can't find anybody to buy that's large, and therefore they're adding on to their existing portfolio. That's how they're getting rid of their money. The key issue for you in the money is the risk, not your upside. You lower the risk of your business, the value goes up, access to capital goes up. And I can talk to you all day long about those kind of issues. But what we tend to do as entrepreneurs is think about growing as opposed to how do I de-risk the business? How do I make it less risky, more stable, more profitable? You do those kind of things and you're going to add value. Okay? Now, we also have one other little thing, and I got, 5 minutes or so?
Yes.
We also have another issue in this country. I was at a university and teaching entrepreneurship for the first class, for the first time. And I don't know what possessed me, but I decided to talk to my students about the idea of profits. And I literally made up 2 definitions out of the air. The first one was, profit ultimately represents the amount that a customer, one of your customers, knowingly provides a company for the value they've received above that company's cost. Right? It's the applause. Profit, if you have a business that's making money, it's because you've won in the marketplace and your customers know you make money. They're knowingly giving, there's a value exchange. They're getting something for what you're doing for them, and they know you're going to make more than your cost. Profit is applause. Then I wrote on the other board, profit ultimately represents the amount that a company receives above its cost structure to the disadvantage of its customers without their knowledge. In other words, screwing the customer. That's the business y'all are in. Which of these do you believe most likely represents how entrepreneurs and companies make money in the United States. When I asked my students, this was not Berkeley, by the way. This was in Nashville. You know, Berkeley, you know which one they would say, right? Sorry if somebody graduated from Berkeley here, but 67% of the students said number 2. So I went to Dr. Ford, a colleague, a real scholar, and he was a former CEO of the Fed, and I said, I think we got a problem. And he said, no, you just have music students in your class. That's literally what he said. You got all the music students. I said, well, big boy, why don't you go take them to your finance students, which he did. He comes back and said, we got a problem. And so that is my one peer-reviewed published paper. And it was all because Dr. Ford was also the editor of the journal. That kind of helps, all right? But basically, I went out, there's, by the way, a list of students' hands who think that you guys screw customers for a living. But what's really crazy is I went out and did a statistical poll across demographics, religions, age, political, etc. Your employees think the same thing. In fact, we're launching a course called Profit Sense for entrepreneurs and employees of theirs to say, let's talk about profits. We got to start defending this, guys. It is nuts to suggest that we're out there. You guys know how hard it is to win in the marketplace, that we're doing that and cheating the customers. How long would we be in business? Not very long. So that is not students, that's the general public. How in God's green earth we got to this point, I don't know. But it makes it a lot more difficult. You got to line up your strategy, you got to line up your employees. It's very difficult. God knows you do want your people to understand that what you're doing is getting the applause from your marketplace. And that's it. I'll be glad to take some questions, but the last thing I will say is that I'll commend you, Jim, and the whole team putting this together. Your biggest competitor is not who you think it is. It's the tyranny of the urgent. My mom used to say, if you take care of the little things, the big things will take care of yourself. Well, that's bullcrap when it comes to growing a business. You have to make a few big decisions right, and you're not going to do that if you don't get strategic. Everybody around this room, everybody that sponsored this, are catalysts to get you strategic about your business. Because a lot of the things you're dealing with are symptoms related to one or two hard decisions you got to make. And one of them could very well be, you know what? I don't have to grow to be successful. I can make a lot of money and I know where my niche is. Or you might have to say, I've got to grow and I've got to make some changes, and those changes and those decisions are pretty good. But you can get there. So, any questions?
Okay.
Yes?
I asked the last executive question too. We talk about culture, any strategy, just any strategy. How can the two coexist?
So I'm a CPA, so I'm kind of analytical. I don't believe the culture is all the fun stuff you do. Okay? I'm very, very convinced that if you don't have the right strategy, culture is not going to drive the. Let me put it this way, you cannot outwork bad strategy. If you don't have a value proposition that wins, you don't have a way to connect to the customer, if your model doesn't make money and you don't have scale, I don't care how happy everybody is, they're all going to get fired. Okay? You have to understand where you are in the business and how you're going to get there and why. And so I don't believe culture eats strategy, because I don't think anybody's defined culture. Culture, in my opinion, let me put it this way. How many of you have ever been in a business where the inner circle was there because of loyalty and loyalty alone? Did the culture suck? It sucks, right? It absolutely sucks. I don't care what you do. If you don't have the right people there for performance, you can't overcome that, because everybody knows that loyalty gets you there and keeps you there rather than performance. So hopefully that's an alternative perspective. Questions? Any other questions? I think we made it through on time. Thank you. What a privilege to get up here and talk with you guys. I'm going to go backwards to Warren. Send me a football player, American football.